Well, today we've got a very, very special guest, Mark Radcliffe. How are you, mate? You well?
I'm okay. Yeah, I'm all right. I'm sitting in my house in Knutsford in Cheshire. It's not raining. It's quite pleasant. I've got a very impatient dog waiting to go out. So if you keep me, then you'll have to answer to Arlo.
Oh, I don't want that. I don't want that. So, so obviously everyone will know you off radio and the telly, but how did you get started then?
Well, I was playing in bands in Manchester. I was at finished university in Manchester, and I was playing in bands, and I always thought that a job involving music would be good because it was the only thing I really liked and really felt any connection with and had any real aptitude for. So I thought any job that involved music would be quite good. And Then Piccadilly Radio was the commercial station in Manchester, and they advertised for a assistant producer for drama and classical music. And I'd been doing a literature degree. My dad was a music critic, and so I'd grown up watching the Halley Orchestra in Manchester. So I knew a little bit about it, and so I went for that, and it started from there really. And while I was there, I was really into the sort of factory records scene and Joy Division and all that sort of stuff in Manchester. And I went to the guy who was running Piccadilly Radio and said, "Listen, there's all this music happening in Manchester, and we're not reflecting it." And he said, "Well, we haven't got anyone who knows anything about it." I said, "Well, I know about it." And he said, "But can you present a radio show?" I said, "Well, how hard can that be, really?" So amazingly, he said, "Yeah, okay, well, you can have 2 hours a week then at the weekend to play all the local indie sounds." And so that's where it started. It started on a Saturday afternoon in the summer when there was no football on. And so that was my first program, which was called Transmission after the Joy Division single. But obviously, it being a radio transmission seemed like a good title. And so that was it really, and it started from there. But really, I was really set on a career path as a producer, and presenting was just a little sort of sideline.
You did a lot of work as a producer, as you say,
Mm,
including working with John Peel there
mm.
for a time. What was that like?
Well, I mean, it was amazing, really, because I worked 4 years at Piccadilly Radio in Manchester, and then I applied for a job in the back pages of the Guardian. Media Guardian used to be on a Monday, I think, and I applied for a job at Radio One as a producer. I didn't know anybody there, and I was on about 24. And I went down for the interview, and it was like, it's not an interesting story. I remember going to an interview and them saying, "Oh, here's a load of ingredients. So how would you build these into a radio show, a magazine program for the weekend?" And I remember saying to them, "Well, I wouldn't have any of these in a magazine program on Radio One." And I remember thinking at the time, that's probably exactly the wrong answer or exactly the right answer. But I thought, well, I was quite happy at Piccadilly Radio and in Manchester. And I wasn't that it seems silly now because it made such a difference going to Radio One, but I wasn't that bothered at the time. Anyway, I got that job, and so suddenly I was in London in Broadcasting House with my own office, and people like John Peel and Anne Nightingale and Johnny Walker dropping by my office, and it was surreal, really. Kind of walking through the front doors of Broadcasting House, probably the most famous broadcasting building in the world, and
Mm.
expecting someone to tap me on the shoulder and saying, "I don't think so, son. There's been a mistake here." And so it was just it was a dream come true, really. I think for the first 6 months, I sort of felt like I was on holiday. I think, record companies would take you out for lunch and you'd sit outside on the pavement, and have your food outside, which we never did in Manchester in those days. And so it was just amazing, and it became quite clear that my life had changed in a big way. And all the people I got to know were all the main names in broadcasting, and those contacts then sort of lasted me for the next 20 years, really.
Obviously, while you was doing that and you was doing a lot of the producing work, you must have met some really interesting people along the way, that came in to do interviews. Looking
Yeah.
back now, is there any sort of personal highlights where even now you go, wow, it was amazing to meet that
Well,
person?
it was amazing really because I was producing a magazine program, and we used to sort of book because it's called Saturday Live. It was on a Saturday afternoon, and we used to book all kinds of guests really. And at the end of the show, I think it was a 2.5 hour show maybe. And at the end of the show, we had a little 10-minute slot where we'd kind of devote that to someone. We'd take a chance on someone up and coming. And I had a friend called Paul White, who worked for Island Rec. No, he worked for Warner Brothers Records at that time. And he said, "Oh God," he said, "I've got this woman coming in from the States." He said, "I can't get her on anywhere." He's like, "She's quite good. It's a bit disco. Would you have her on?" And he was a mate of mine. And I listened to the record and I thought, "Oh yeah, it's all right." I said, "Yeah, okay, fine, we'll have her on." And we couldn't get a studio, so we recorded an interview there was a little basement studio at Radio One where they just recorded trails and adverts and things like that and jingles. And so on a Friday afternoon, we got her in to come and do 5 minutes, and she was quite small. She had a leather jacket on and badly dyed peroxide blonde hair. Madonna. And it seems incredible
Wow.
now that we no one ever thought she was going to be that big. She was quite good fun. There are moments like that when you think that obviously you meet people when they're nothing, and then she becomes one of the biggest stars in the world, and you never see that happening. I mean, the people who it's been the biggest thrill for me to meet was obviously Paul McCartney and Bruce Springsteen and Kate Bush and all these kinds of people. But I suppose the big one for me will always be David Bowie, who was my hero when I was kind of growing up in Bolton. I was a teenager, and then to find myself in the same room as him was amazing. And so I still really cherish the times that I spent with him, which I met him about 7 or 8 times. And so that's a real cherished memories. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you meet him then really early on, just before he was Ziggy Stardust and he'd
No,
blown
no,
up everywhere?
no, 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 because that was when I was just a fan. I was still at school then, and we went to see Ziggy Stardust in Manchester at the Manchester Hard Rock, I think in 1972 when I was 14. And so I didn't meet him until much later on, sort of the 80s. And actually, his career was sort of a bit in the doldrums then, really. He was playing well clubs, really. He wasn't even playing theatres, I don't think, let alone arenas or anything. And so he had an album called Outside, which was a kind of dystopian concept album. And we just approached him and said, "Would you be on?" And he said, "Yeah." And we went to, myself and Mark Riley, who was doing the show at that time, went to New York to interview him, went to see him in Boston, which was amazing. And that's when the first time we met him. And I think he recognized that we were big fans and we had a laugh on the radio show. He had a great sense of humor. He always wanted to have fun. He was never overly serious. And so then we sort of struck a sort of affinity, really. And I think that he sort of appreciated that we were big fans, and we'd kind of supported him on the airwaves when he wasn't really getting much airplay. He wasn't. He was maybe doing like 600-700 people if he did a gig. It seems bizarre now, but he was not a big deal at that stage in his career.
Yeah, my dad, he was a fisherman out of Hull in the 70s, early
Okay.
70s. And his friend's mum owned a bookshop. He goes to the bookshop and this lady goes, "Oh, go in the back and, David's through there." And this was when he'd literally just formulated the look of Ziggy
Yeah.
Stardust, maybe a year before he blew up. And he was there in the back room and they literally just had a chat and this and that. And fast forward a few years to about 2016, my dad just said to me, "Oh, I met him. Me being a fan, I was like,
Oh,
what? You've never told me that in my life." He said, "Oh yeah, he gave us a ticket to go to the Hull Theatre or whatever gig it was in that time." I
well, all
said,
his band were
"Now
from Hull, weren't they? Because Mick Ronson and all the Spiders from
the
Mars,
Spies from Mars."
Woody Woodmansey, they were all from Hull.
I have this view, Mark, and I don't know if you possibly may agree on this, but I've often thought Mick Ronson, especially, never truly among the masses got the credit he deserved.
I think that's very
Uh,
true. I think that like Bowie wrote the songs, but I think a lot of the way they
that
crafted the
sound,
sound and the
yeah,
arrangements, a lot to do with Mick Ronson. And they were the kind of new Mick and Keith, really, David Bowie and Mick Ronson. It could have been a band like the Stones where they were kind of, equals, really. So I agree with you that Mick Ronson never got the respect. I think he probably does now in retrospect, but at the time, I think, he was known as Bowie's guitarist, but he was his co-producer and his
and
arranger.
so much more than
Yeah,
that.
he did so much for, yeah, so much. Yeah, amazing. Yeah.
I can imagine Bowie later on, way past the era that he was with the Spider from Mars, when he had time to reflect and look back and go, "Wow, that journey's been incredible." But
Yeah. I think
He
it's
did,
interesting, isn't it? If Mick Ronson hadn't died, I sort of like to think they would have come back together again at some point. That Mick would,
yeah,
that Bowie would have acknowledged and said, you know what, it was great when I was with Mick. Let's try it again. I suppose when you're on that career path and everybody keeps telling you you're great and you think you can do it on your own. And I mean, he did amazing things, obviously after he worked with Ronson, but I think probably Ronson was undervalued a bit. Yeah.
and he obviously worked with many stars, and Lou Reed as well afterwards, and a few bits and bobs.
Played with
But
Bob Dylan for a bit.
that's right, you played with Bob Dylan, yeah. I was watching the documentary they made a few years ago about that dynamic of Mick and David, and you look back now and you just think if they could have bottled that dynamic, that chemistry,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
famous scene of them on top of the pots,
Well,
and
absolutely. And so, like, if Mick hadn't if Mick hadn't been there, then Bowie wouldn't have done that. And so that was one of the definitive and sort of unforgettable moments, isn't it? And that was Bowie and Ronson, not just Bowie.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think as someone from Hull myself, I think
Mm.
even the natives in the city probably don't even necessarily know as much about him as they should.
Well, it was
So I
funny,
think
wasn't it? Really, because they were a bit they were in the background. It was always a surprise when you first heard Mick Ronson speak, really, because Bowie spoke a certain way, and so I'm from the north, so I'm not remotely disparaging about any accent. I love all the kind of accents and all that, but when the way Mick Ronson looked as this glamorous kind of blonde androgynous figure in all the glitter. When he opened his mouth and he sounded like your dad who'd come off a trawler in Hull, it was a surprise. It just
yeah,
was, it wasn't the voice you expected to hear. And that endeared him even more to me. It's like, oh yeah, he's kind of because Bowie seemed like the Starman and from another universe. But then Mick Ronson was kind of one of us who'd made it onto the spaceship with him. He was kind of,
yeah.
in a way, he was the bridge from us to David.
What was your favorite Bowie track then?
Well, I mean, there are so many to choose from, aren't there, really? I mean, my favourite Bowie album would always be Ziggy Stardust, I think, followed by Hunky Dory. And so I have great affection for the opening track of Ziggy Stardust, which is 5 Years. Just because it was the first, I remember just buying that record and listening to it in Bolton on my bed, bought it with my paper round money and listening to the drums and pushing through the market square. And I'm thinking, this is a whole other world, really, that's opening up to me now. It was amazing. So I think I would always go back to that one, but there are so many. And I have great affection for Heroes because I just think it's a bit like Patti Smith and People Have the Power. It just makes you feel like powerful. It makes you feel like you could be a hero just for one day. It's such an uplifting thing that I have great affection for that. The thing that's remarkable about Heroes is that, many things remarkable about it, but one is like, what number did it get to in the top 30? What was the highest position it attained? And, you'd never guess it. The highest position that got was number 24.
Wow.
Because it's like the idea that there were 23 records that were sort of selling better than that in a week. There haven't been 23 better records than that made ever, I don't think. And so it goes
No.
number 24. I suppose maybe all his fans have bought the album might explain that.
Yeah, yeah, probably right. Now, you've interviewed a lot of people throughout your career, and I think you even got the first interview with Kate Bush when she came back for a time, didn't she?
Yes,
What
yes.
was that like?
Well, amazing. I mean, like I started it as a kind of joke because she never did anything. And so every night on my shows, on late night radio too at that point, and every night I said something along the lines of, "Oh, hi Kate, like give us a ring and let us know you're okay." And it was like every night we would mention Kate Bush, and we used to measure the number of days that we hadn't heard from Kate Bush, never expecting to hear from her. And then news came that she was making a new album called Ariel, which was a double album, which is a brilliant thing. And I said, oh, well, and Radio 2, they said, well, do you know anyone close to her? I said, no. Then I thought about it. I thought the head of EMI at the record company was a guy called Tony Wadsworth, who I was at school with. And we used to play in bands together in Bolton in our younger days. And so I got in touch with Tony. I said, listen, do you think there's any chance that she's going to do anything? He said, probably not. He said, but he said, I'm in touch with her. I will ask. I will ask. So then he came back and he said, well, here's a surprise. She says that maybe she will. But she wants to talk to you first to see if she thinks you'll get on. So I've given her your phone number. This was in the early days of mobile phones, I guess. And so every time the phone rang, I was like jumping, like, oh God, oh no, Mum, I'm waiting for Kate Bush. And of course, as is the way with these things, somehow I missed the call. I missed the call. And I remember it vividly. I was staying with some friends in York, actually, and I played the message back, and it was like, Kate Bush is in this phone. She was like, say, oh, hi, Mark. I believe we might have a chat. That sounds like it might be fun. Anyway, give me a ring. Well, we're playing it back and playing it back. Say, it's Kate Bush in the phone. And so then she agreed to do it. And then she said, well, come down to the house. She lived near Reading at that stage. She had a kind of, a sort of nice house, not a kind of rock star mansion, quite a nice big sort of country house with a studio in the garden. I remember they did have a little water wheel. There's a mill in the garden. And we went down there and she just answered the door herself, and she was just kind of in a pair of jeans and a floaty top and barefoot, and moved the washing off the chairs in the kitchen so he could sit down. And she said, I've been busy, so I haven't had time to cook you anything, but I've got these cheese flans from the supermarket. Will those do? I'm like, yeah, great. So she was very hospitable. And then again, I struck up a bit of an affinity with her, really. So I met her another sort of 3 or 4 times and did interviews with her. And, she's always really charming. I mean, she's kind of a bit, how would you describe it? She's kind of mildly eccentric, sort of kooky, but very, very friendly, super smiley, not remotely standoffish or trying to be cool. And it's just, again, like the Bowie thing, just one of those people who you never really expect that you're going to know in any way, shape or form, or even be in the same room as. So that was a joy as well. Yeah.
Would that definitely be one of your sort of pinch me moment interviews from what you looked to before you got into radio and what you would have
Yeah.
thought, oh my God, will that ever
Yeah.
happen?
I mean, there've been a few of those, and one of the ones that I really remember was the Radio 2 were doing a series called Sold on Song. It was about songwriting, and I went to Abbey Road, and the studios to do an interview with Paul McCartney, and there was talking about songwriting, and
Wow.
so we were in the studio where the Beatles had recorded, and there was only me and him in the room because all the engineers were recording it through the glass, in the control room. And so there was just me and Paul McCartney, and he had an acoustic guitar there. And we were chatting about how he'd written different things. And he said, and so when I wrote Blackbird, and he played Blackbird on the guitar about 3 feet away from me, just me and him in the studio, you think, how's this happened, really? You sort of have an out-of-body experience, really. You think me, just a schoolboy from Bolton who was listening to the Beatles is now in Abbey Road with Paul McCartney, and he's playing Blackbird for me in front of me. There's only me here. And you do have the sort of out-of-body experience, really. I had the same thing with Bowie backstage at the Hammersmith Odeon when I was introducing him, and he had the set list, he'd handwritten out. He said, I'm not quite sure about this. He says, do you think we should put Heroes there after Changes, or shall I do Suffragette City there? I'm like, what, you're asking me? And again, an out-of-body experience. And I was trying to not be a gibbering idiot and give him a sensible answer of what I thought, but those are the moments. Clearly no one ever expects those to happen. And so looking back on it now, they're incredible. They're forever frozen in my mind.
In your early days, before you used to go and conduct these interviews with these huge stars, was there anything you would do, almost not as a ritual or as a superstition, but was there anything you would do to go, right, I'll prepare myself this way? Mentally, is there anything you used to do where you'd be like, okay, it's going to go this way, this is what we're going to do? Or was it always just very chill and get the job done type of mindset?
Well, I mean, I've always been a believer in preparation, really. I go and I write my questions down, and I write them in a notebook, and I don't try and kind of conceal that. I have it on my knee and I glance down at it so I know where I'm going, because I've got an idea what I want the show to sound like in the end. And in fact, the rituals of sort of meeting the biggest stars are always the same, really. You always go through a couple of press people and then go to a hotel room, and they come in, and they all the big stars in my experience have been really easy and charming because they don't need to do it. And if they've decided to do it, then they do it with very good grace. And so, but the one thing I do remember was the first time meeting David Bowie, and it just seemed such a big thing for me. And my wife said, oh, I was in New York. She said, ring me when you've done it. Let me know how it went. And when I rang her back after it, I found that I couldn't really speak. And it was like all the nerves I'd suppressed before the interview then got to me afterwards, that I said, I can't talk about this. I need to just go and sit down somewhere for a bit and think about it. And I'll call you back in a bit. I think you have to learn in a way to suppress nerves, because they want to have a conversation. They don't want to be met by someone who's a gibbering idiot. They've decided to devote this time. They want to do a proper interview and a proper chat. So I think you do have to set your own emotions aside a little bit, really. You just have to learn to do that. And not regard it as a big deal at the moment that you're doing it. You can regard it as a big deal once you've done it, or in the build up to it, of course. And they're only people, I mean, they are only people. And most of as I say, the biggest stars, once they decide to do it, because they don't need to promote anything, so they're not doing it under duress. They've decided to do it. So once they've decided to do it, they do it with very good grace. And so they actually, in my experience, I've never had a bad experience of someone, very famous. And the bad experiences you have are with sort of RC up and coming bands who think they're too cool for school, and I think they're doing you a favor by talking to you. And you do want to take them by the scruff of the neck and you say, hey, I've done Paul McCartney and David Bowie and Kate Bush, it doesn't really matter to me, this, but let's press on, and so the biggest stars always tend to make it quite easy for you, really.
You also interviewed Queen, haven't you, at some point in your career?
Well, I never met Freddie Mercury. I mean, I remember going and seeing Queen at Manchester University when I was there. 60 pence it was.
Wow.
And I remember going to see Queen. And so, yeah, Brian May and Roger Taylor, yeah. But I don't know them very well, but they're very charming. They're quite kind of I wouldn't say posh shows, but they're very sort of, middle class and polite and very, good, well-mannered and nice people. I mean, John Deacon's the one who fascinates me in Queen, really. I mean, he's almost got a unique position in world pop, hasn't he, John Deacon? Of being, probably they were the world's biggest band at one point. And to decide not to take any part in it and to never appear and to be sort of, you see occasional photos of him with sort of balding with a fag in his mouth going for the paper at the corner shop,
Yeah.
While the other two are still being Queen with all the glamour that surrounds. That's really, I've got a lot of, I think it's fascinating that I've got a lot, because we live in an age obsessed with fame, and a lot of people just want to be famous for fame's sake. And the idea, and I think Kate Bush is a bit true of this, the idea that you achieve all these things, but the fame is the bit you found you liked least. That John Deacon obviously liked being in a band and like the energy of it, and he presumably liked the money and the creative stuff. But being a celebrity and being famous is the bit that he liked least, and that's the bit he wanted to leave behind. And I find that very interesting. I think it's unusual. I don't think many people would really. And I have a lot of time for people who find big success and then say, no, do you know what? I'm done. I've said what I said what I came to say, and I'm done now. And I don't want to keep doing it over and over again. The same thing. I've got a lot of time for people like that.
Moving on, then, you hosted a show, a successful show, Mark and Lard,
Mm.
which won awards and was
Mm.
incredibly successful there. What was that like? How did that come to be?
Do you know, next March, it's 20 years since it finished.
Wow.
I was just on March the 24th, 2004. That sort of happened by accident, really. I was doing a program for Radio 5. It was called Hit the North, which was kind of music and interviews from Manchester. When Manchester was it was sort of Manchester, so it was very hot, and the Hacienda and all that. Manchester was very sort of the centre of the universe in some ways, musically. And Mark Riley was someone who I knew who was, he'd been in The Fall, and he was a record plugger. And he came on, he was just doing a sort of gossip column about who he'd seen about Manchester. And of course, the joke was he'd never seen anybody really, that he had nothing to say. And so that was the kind of where that relationship of me and him started. And he was a lot chubbier in those days. And so as an insult, I used to call him Lardy Boy. And so Lard came from that. And then when we went to Radio 1 on the late night show, we used to call it the graveyard shift show, he came with me there. And so it was still my show, and he was doing little bits of sketches and things like that. And then they offered us the Radio 1 breakfast show when Chris Evans left. And so we went to do that, and that sort of proved a disastrous mistake, really. We kind of found ourselves out of our depth, really, there, and or not the right thing for breakfast. And so we got sacked 6 months into a 2-year contract. But then they put us on in the afternoons, and suddenly the pressure was off from breakfast, and we totally found our feet there, really. And really, all we ever wanted to do was play the records we liked and do things that made us laugh. I can honestly say we never gave the audience a second thought, really. We just were doing it for ourselves. And before you knew it, we had, I think, 8 million listeners. And, it just seemed, we sort of led a charmed life there for a bit. It seemed like for a little while we could do no wrong. That really kind of established our names in a way. And in some ways, all the work we've had since then is because we made such a big hit as Mark and Lard. So, yeah, it's 20 years next year. So we're just wondering whether we certainly wouldn't do a radio show again, but maybe we should do something to mark the fact that it's 20 years since it finished. And people still love it, and people still kind of shout the catchphrases at me. And there's loads of stuff on YouTube and everything. And so I feel very proud that we did stuff that, obviously made such an impression on people that they're still listening to it and thinking about it to this day. I think there aren't many radio shows that have done that over the years, really. So I do feel very proud.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, what a legacy and a show to leave behind. It's always better to leave people wanting more, right?
Well, right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, you obviously have throughout your career in radio and the like, have given new up and coming artists a chance on your show, including the likes of Nick Cave and Moloko. How did you go about picking the ones that you thought, right, they've got something? Did you see them in person, or did someone hand you the CDs or whatever to listen to?
Yeah, usually, I would get, you obviously in those days you would read the music press, and in those days when we were younger, we went to a load of gigs, and so people would make an impression on you that way. I mean, and a lot of the time, record companies would send you stuff, and I've always made it, to this day, I listen to everything I get sent because you never know. I used to come back. You used to have big piles of CDs that I'd work through. Now it tends to be kind of the links and WAVs and MP3s and streams and things. But I do listen to everything that I get sent, not all the way through, because now I'm only doing 3 shows a week: the 2-6 music shows and the folk show. So because there's sorts of I can listen to something now and think, yeah, that might be good, but it's not for me. I have nowhere to place that. So I move on to the next thing. And I wouldn't listen necessarily to the whole of an album. I'd listen to the first couple of tracks and think, well, I don't know, it's not really for me. It isn't sort of taking me any further. If I like something, then I listen through to it and try and find what I think is the best track. And it's really just we never thought of oh, these guys are going to be big. We've always just thought do I like it? Do I like it? Is it something that I'd want to hear in my own show, and we've had a lot of free choice over the years. We've worked with playlists as well, and I don't have a problem with that. I think I probably at Radio 1, when I was more kind of arsey, I probably sort of argued the toss a bit more back then. But now on 6 Music, obviously a lot of the records that we play are things I would probably choose to play anyway. And so really I've never tried to be a talent spotter. All I've done, and by the, and really, I suppose, just by the simple law of statistics and averages, really, if you play as many new records as I've played over so many years, then by the law of averages, some of those people are going to succeed, and the vast majority of them are going to fall by the wayside. And that's okay. That's the way of the world. People sometimes nothing lasts forever, and sometimes people have a brief career that sort of glimmers very brightly and then it fades away, and some people have more staying power, and either is fine. But I've always wanted to listen to new things. I've got friends now who have gone to work for stations where they only play the hits of the past, and I can't imagine doing that, where you're kind of almost pretending that the last 30 years in music hasn't happened, let alone the future. I can't imagine doing that, really, because I always think that if you travel, surely you'd want to continue seeing new places. If you like food, you'd always want to experience new restaurants, new recipes and things. So if you like music, why would you suddenly at a certain age decide, yeah, I'm not listening to anything new now, I'm just listening to the things that I listened to when I was 14 or 24 or 40 or whatever? It's for me at the age of 65, it's still it's a never ending voyage of discovery. That's the joy of it, that you might hear something you think, wow, yeah, quite a lot of the time I'll hear things and it reminds me of things that I heard when I was 14 or 24 or 40, because we've heard a lot of music now. But then, just, I don't know, the joy of hearing something brand new, you think, that's great, I'm really excited to play that on the radio. I mean, that's one of the joys of it for me.
You just mentioned a minute ago about how we obviously present the folk show on Radio
Mm.
2. Can you remember the first moment where you got into folk as a younger man?
Well, yes, but I mean, in a way, I think that when I first started getting into pop music, it seemed in a way it was less kind of tribal and less divided into genres. I think we've come back. I think with streaming and everything, I think we've come almost full circle on that. But when I was at school, you were a kind of either a rock fan or a soul boy or whatever, and so you were kind of had your gang of like-minded people. But really, just before that, I mean, I got into it like everybody else by listening to the radio and watching Top of the Pops and listening to the charts and things. And there were, and to me, it was just all music. So people like Ralph McTell or Steel Eye Span or Lindisfarne or Cat Stevens, those people, they were in the charts. So I didn't think, oh, this is a different thing. So it wasn't, obviously, it was kind of folk tinged hits, singer songwriter things. It wasn't the traditional tunes and the kind of, the Celtic session music. That came a bit later that I sort of discovered that. But when I was growing up, in Bolton, if you went to the pubs where the folk clubs were on, you could get in even if you were underage and by half a mile, and sit at the back and listening to some folk. And the thing that really one of the first things that really appealed to me about the world of folk, and I think this has been important for me in this way I've done radio shows really, is that in contrast to rock audiences, the people on the stage, if there was a stage, often with folk there wasn't, really talked to the audience and really connected with them. So, there were people like all those great raconteurs, people like my predecessor on the folk show, Mike Harding, and Billy Connolly, Max Boyce, Jasper Carrot. All those people basically came out of folk clubs where they were telling stories about the songs, and eventually the stories took over from the songs. And I always really loved that. And found that really interesting. And, when you go and see a big rock act who you really, really like, I remember like sometimes being disappointed by the lack of connection, really, between the audience and the artist. It didn't have to be talking so much. It was just a sort of acknowledgement. I don't know. Some people, like with Bowie, it would almost have, if he'd said too much, it would almost have broken something. It would almost have, so I'm not universally applying this. But, if you go and see, people you like who are kind of singer-songwriter and everything, and there's not a word between songs, I always find that a little bit disappointing. And with folk acts, it's absolutely expected that you will do that. And so even people who are very young are still expected to talk. And once they start trying to talk and they give that, then the people will meet them more than halfway. So for me, as well as the influence of the music, it was the style of presentation, which I think has influenced everything that I've done, really, that came from the folk clubs, and certainly all those Malcolm Large shows. We were introducing records, but there was sort of roundabout ways with lots of detours in them and digressions in with the links and the sketches that we were doing that eventually led to the record. And I think now I look back on it, I think a lot of that came from the folk clubs.
I got into folk properly about 10 years ago when I heard Passenger.
Mm,
And for some reason, I don't know if it was just an age thing as well, as just being at a different point in my life, that music gravitated to me more than other
mm,
stuff. But there is certainly that storytelling aspect that has never truly gone away with that genre of music, isn't it?
very much so.
In fact, I even went to a little festival in Birmingham called Moseley Folk Festival
I
the
was
other year.
there this year. I was there this year.
What a festival that is! It's
Beautiful
great.
setting, lovely park, isn't it? And yeah, no, it's great. John Fell, who runs that, is a good guy, really good guy. And he also manages a wonderful singer songwriter called Catherine Priddy. I don't know if you've heard her, but check her out if you haven't. She's amazing.
I remember I was leaving the show after it had finished, and I was so busy I was just not getting lost that my other half went to me. She nudged me and went, "Passenger's over there. He's about to get in his
Mm-hmm.
bus." But I was so like in that zone of don't do that thing. Don't go up to
Oh, I
them
know. Good for
and get
you.
a picture or an autograph. That's the last
Good
thing
for
we
you.
want.
Okay.
Um, so obviously you've done all sorts of things. You're an author. You've been in bands. Is there any one thing that you can look back now and think, right, I really love that for this reason because it unlocks this part of myself?
Well, I think that, I still kind of have the disappointment of never having been in a successful band in a way. And in some ways, I always think that radio's been me sort of has been second best. I used to think that. Whereas now I think that that's stupid, really. I kind of got more or less to the top of radio, be doing like Radio One shows and everything. But so the idea to kind of, I just feel sort of generally kind of proud that I did it my own way, really. A lot of those times when people tried to make you conform and do certain things, and so me and Mark Riley, we would say, no, we're not doing that. We're doing it our own way, and we were. I think the thing that I feel proud of is that we were prepared to fail, really. Well, we did fail on the Breakfast Show, but I think that none of us really, we didn't really think of it as it was going to be our career. We always thought it would be short lived, and none of us wanted to go through being a DJ and then become a kind of TV quiz host or anything. It wasn't a career path. It was just it wasn't a means to an end. It was an end in itself. And I remember when I was very young, like going back to the beginning of our conversation of how I started, I remember thinking if I could do a job that I enjoyed, a job with music, then I would settle for sort of less money, really. If I could just have a house and a small car, but do a job I enjoyed. I'm quite proud of myself for that, thinking that at quite a young age that, well, you're going to be working for quite a long time. So it's better being a job that you don't hate, and feel quite proud of that. And it's all been, even now to this day, the show I do with Stuart McConey at the weekend, it's still fun. I mean, it's still, I still enjoy it. And there's still a bit of me that only comes alive when I'm on air, I think. And so I feel proud that all along I've kind of done it my own way, really. And so yeah, when I look back, so because of that, I don't really have many regrets. The mistakes I made, I think, were mistakes that, unless you were going to play it ultra safe, you couldn't avoid making, really. And with the Breakfast Show, I've come to regard failure on that grander scale. It was the biggest radio show in Europe. There's a certain sort of noble aspect of failure on that grander scale, I think. And I still think that, well, no one else would have tried to do it the way we did it. And okay, well, we failed, but we tried to do something different. And so I look back and I feel proud of that.
Final two.
Yeah.
What do you think has been the best artist you've seen while you've been at Glastonbury and doing all the TV bits?
Well, I mean, obviously, people talk about the Bowie headline set. It's funny watching that now because, if you look at the headline sets at Glastonbury now, I think possibly since Beyonce, but you look at the level of production, it's like a sort of Las Vegas show. You look at Bowie, it's kind of just a bloke in a nice coat singing some songs. There's no big lights, there's nothing spectacular about it. It seems from a very different age, really. And so there've been so many moments at festivals. I remember being on the side of the stage, not at Glastonbury, but at Reading, actually, when Nirvana played their final ever show in the UK, and thinking, God, it was like a bomb going off. It was incredible. It was incredible. And I also remember, the other sort of end of the spectrum, really, on my 50th birthday at Glastonbury, I remember standing on the side of the stage while Leonard Cohen was doing Hallelujah and watching everybody sing along in the afternoon sunshine and thinking, well, that's this is quite a special way to celebrate your 50th birthday, and Leonard Cohen had slowed the whole of Glastonbury down to his own time, and it felt sort of really strangely intimate. And as I say, the sun was shining, which, as we all know, is not a guarantee at Glastonbury. And so, yeah, I often think back to that day. Yeah.
Final one then. When you retire, what's going to be the one moment that you look back on, all the things you've done in your career, where you go, wow, I'm really proud of that.
Well, um, what would that be? I think, um, I think what I would look, one of the moment I remember, the moment I think that I would look back on it is because it's where things changed for me. Really, it was like when I was doing the Radio 5 show and another couple of little bits of Radio 1, and Matthew Bannister took over at Radio 1, and he phoned me. No, he came up. He came up and he talked to me, and we went for a pizza, I think, with my great friend and producer John Leonard at that time. And I remember him saying, "We'd like you to do 4 nights a week." And I'm thinking, my life's changed at this point, because I'm no longer a producer who presents a couple of shows. I'm going to be this presenter. And in fact, the way the BBC was structured at that time, I had to leave the staff and leave my pension and all those sorts of things. And so when I look back, I mean, I would think of that. I would, it's pride of the work that came after, but that was the moment where you think someone sits and says, "I've got this plan for you. We think you should do this, and we think it'll be great." And you think, yeah, that's kind of, life has changed at this moment. Things are never going to be quite the same.
Wow. Um, quickly. Is it true that you passed up the opportunity to see the Beatles when you were younger, or is
Well,
that been blown out of
I think
proportion?
I think I did. I think, and I can't confirm it now because my dad was a journalist and my dad worked with the Beatles, and we went to Liverpool, and my recollection is that he gave me the choice of going to see Jerry and the Pacemakers or the Beatles, and I chose Jerry and the Pacemakers. That's my recollection, and that's my recollection of what he told me. He's no longer with us, so I can't. So it's possible, yes.
Wow. Well. On that note, thank you so much for giving me your time, Mark. It's been a
No,
pleasure on my end.
nice to talk to you, Jordan. And I hope to be, hopefully, I'm coming to the Isle of Wight. Are you Isle of Wight or Isle of Man?
No, Isle of Wight.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
Isle of Wight.
So hopefully, my friend Paul Armfield, who's the folk singer based on the Isle of Wight, and he's got a bookshop, and hopefully next August we're going to come and play to 30 people in his bookshop. So me and my mate
Lovely.
Dave on 2 acoustic guitars. So hopefully I'll see you on the island next year.
Brilliant. Well, when you start promoting that, I'll come down and see it.
Great. I'd love to see you, Jordan. That'd be nice. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, mate. Perfect.
Cheers. Thank
See.
you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.